Thank you so much. My name is Hangqing Ruan, and it's a little bit tricky. Hangqing is like 100, change is Hangqing, so it's like a Chinese character. Okay, my paper is about divergent trends in mortality inequality across like developed countries and low middle income countries, uh, based on a fundamental cause theory perspective. So I will start with some background. I think we all know that SES disparities in health, in mortality, all these kind of things has become one of the most critical public policy challenges, both in developed countries and low and middle income countries. Uh, when we are trying to have some like explanations, we always say, okay, we have a lot of like social change in our like social, economic, or technical, or environmental, anything changes, and then our social inequality or economic inequality goes up. For example, we have higher income inequality, wealth inequality, occupation polarization, unequal healthcare, blah blah, these kind of things, and all these kind of changes make our health or mortality inequality goes up. So that's the basic stories of a lot of like explanations. Um, we do observe persistent and widening health inequalities in countries like developed countries like US, UK, and Canada, a lot of countries. We see this kind of long-term trends, I think at least since 1970s or even earlier. But at the same time, we see great achievement in the like overall life expectancy. So our life expectancy increased very like substantially. So this it's a little bit tricky why we are so successful in making the life expectancy increases, even though the COVID make it declined for like 3 years. But in general, it's still so successful, but we're so unsuccessful in make the like health inequality declines. So this is like first like puzzle things. Another one is like we observe substantial inequalities in countries like US and UK, which is like to some extent not surprised because UK, US, all these countries have very substantial income, wealth inequality, etc. But we also see widening and big health inequalities in countries like Sweden and other Nordic countries where the social welfare system are much more generous and with much smaller social income wealth inequalities. So it's like different developed countries have totally different trends and patterns in health inequality, and it's not usually consistent with SES inequality. And another thing is that if we take a look at the trends in low and middle income countries, we still see substantial inequalities there, but the patterns are really different. Here I have one example from India. So this graph comes from a dissertation in 2021 from Gupta. So I just picked up several numbers from that dissertation. It shows us the life expectancy across household wealth from the poorest octile to the wealthiest octile. So at two time points, first is 1919 to 1999, second is 2013 to 2016. So we can say for both male and female, the life expectancy inequalities are very like significant. However, if we see the trends, it seems like the inequality in 2010s are smaller than it was in 1990s. So the inequality just goes down. But we will know India is like also one of the most like unequal like countries all around the world, and the income, the occupation inequality, these kind of things has been widening, but the health inequalities just goes down. So that's like inconsistent trends. And another country like China, which is I'm like to some extent familiar with, there are also more and more papers shows that the inequality, some of the health inequalities, some outcomes not just goes up. For example, in one paper from Chen, it shows the convergence in income and educational gaps in like self-reported health, like health outcomes. And another paper from Huang and Prokuchi in 2022, this paper shows that the education and wealth seems not to predict health outcomes like diabetes, hypertension, smoking, or drinking. And even for some health outcomes like overweight, there are even like negative association. So it's like a very like unusual, or some if our theory is like social inequality, income inequality leads to health inequality. So that makes me think about that this part of the story is not like is like incomplete. We must ignore some mechanisms here because the existing explanation cannot explain what is kind of inconsistent trends. So so what I'm doing is like I'm going back to the fundamental cause theory because this theory tells us, of course, like flexible resources are important, but it also tells that the health inequality can changes because of not because social economic inequalities, but also because, for example, the medical innovation, the technologies, for example, for some kinds of diseases, if there are new medical innovations, treatment, intervention, prevention, this kind of things comes out, in most of the cases, they will be very expensive. So people with more resources will benefit more, benefit first. Then we can say health inequalities goes up. But when this kind of interventions becomes cheap and becomes universally available, health inequalities will goes down. That's the basic argument of fundamental theory. And this theory also tells us that different diseases, because they are experiencing different like evolution of medical treatment, medical innovations, so they will have totally different patterns of inequality and trends of inequality. So with this in mind, I just examined the trends of mortality inequality in the US from 1970 to 2020. So this graph comes from my dissertation. I calculated the mortality inequality at the county level. So it's like a mortality at the richest county versus the poorest county. And then I do it by cause of death. Here, I split it into three cause of death, like chronic injuries and infectious diseases. The two added together equals the all-cause mortality. So we can say in overall, of course, the inequality goes up, especially in 1985 to 1990, and then it a little bit levels off and then goes up again in 2010s. But if we see the structure of the three broad cause of death, the chronic conditions contribute to the most part of increase. If we split it by more detailed cause of death, we can even have more like interesting stories. Here, so these two are the same graph. I just split the cause of death with more details. In this graph, you can see the heart disease is the like biggest contributor of the rising mortality inequality. And we can also say increase in cancer, like lung cancer, other cancer. So the cancers, even in the early years, we can say there are some negative inequality because in the 1970s, it seems like richer people are more likely to get cancer. They survive more like time, they have more opportunity. But as time goes on, we have medical innovations in heart disease treatment, in cancer screening, in a lot of like skills to manage the chronic conditions. As this kind of process goes up, inequalities totally increase dramatically. So this is the situation in the US, but it do tell us that as the social economic changes, social economic inequality changes, of course, this kind of income inequality, wealth inequality, this kind of thing will affect health inequality, but this is just part of the story. We have another part of the story is about the changes in our medical innovation, in our what kind of diseases people are exposed. So so here I have some kind of new framework. I focus on the changes in medical innovation, public health intervention, like quality of life or lifestyle, like smoking, like nutrition. So the changes in this kind of things, they are linked to the changes of we call it epidemiological transition from different disease patterns, like chronic diseases, like infectious disease, like COVID. So disease patterns changes all the time. And these kind of disease patterns work together with our medical innovations. They will shift the balance of health inequality across diseases. And as a result, our overall disease patterns and overall health and mortality inequality patterns changes. So this is this I only have data in the US, but I think this story happens in all the countries. So if we are comparing the health inequalities in low and middle income countries, in the long term history trends, we will have very interesting stories. But I don't have that kind of data right now. I focus on my research in the US, but hopefully I want to extend this kind of perspective to other countries. Okay, that's my presentation. Thank you very much.